least, talk about AI in general and address some of the buzz that's going on out there. But more importantly, use some examples in practice and talk a little bit about what we're trying to do with the Institute for Experiential AI at Northeastern University. We have a unique approach for academia, at least in the United States, in higher ed, that we think is exciting. So the overview of this talk, look, the main theme is, making AI work correctly is kind of one of the grand challenges facing us today. And I actually, used some of the hype from a couple of years ago, except now, of course, it's getting a lot more. What happened, of course, through COVID-19 pandemic, digitization took over. To leverage AI simply because digitization generates a heck of a lot more data, and to keep up with it and to benefit in a digital world. Machine learning is the dominant part of any working AI, whether you like that or not. It's kind of the reality. Machine learning got used as a shortcut to bypass a lot of the problems in human intelligence that we don't understand how to address. And that's primarily because we have a lot more data than we have algorithms. And of course, ML has a huge dependency on data, which is a big deal that's also not talked about a lot. So the question then becomes for this talk, how does this affect healthcare? How does this affect life sciences? And how does it go into kind of the world of drug discovery? And AI has been used in drug discovery for a while. I'll start with this example that I've used before. I call it kind of a tale of two illustrative journeys. The reason I say that is I use radiology on one extreme of the spectrum where people long ago decided, hey, we can take digital x-rays, they don't have to be physical anymore. We can send them to concentrated centers where we have our readers specializing in reading. And we can basically turn them around and provide the readout reports to the providers to communicate back to the patient and to decide what to do. The fact that they centralized this reading created an amazing data set and created a great opportunity to kind of say, okay, what's being done by humans can be now aided by algorithms who may sometimes detect things that are missed, who may sometimes, of course, make mistakes, but then get feedback. And that resulted in optimizing the reading to the point where I would say in radiology, it's a great example of AI being used. The other extreme of the spectrum is something that exists in every hospital and many clinics, pathology, which is still kind of in the land of analog, physical slides being stored. Pathology labs do have laser scanners, high resolution, but they only use them to kind of communicate over a few things. The typical practice is to kind of keep it analog, which is an example of something else that could be very ready for a kind of a leverage of AI and data, but the data isn't there, right? It's just people haven't done that. In electronic medical records, they were hailed in the US as a great hope because there was a law basically that says you shall use electronic health records. Problem is, the law didn't address standardization. So what we have is, no two each AHRs look the same. It's a very fragmented space, many vendors in the space. The average hospital in the US has 16 disparate EMR vendors in use. And most hospitals have 10 EHR systems. And only 2% are down to only 2, which many consider like a huge advance that, hey, you're down to 2. And the real question is, well, why isn't it down to kind of one standardized thing? And we'll come back and talk about standards towards the end of this talk. Meanwhile, of course, the platform in the United States is burning. The cost of healthcare is simply unsustainable and unaffordable. It's about over 4 trillion of total medical spend in the US. About more than 400 billion is estimated to go into administrative waste. Some people argue it's because we don't have a single payer system like you guys have in the UK, but there's many other reasons going into this. In any case, in my words, the platform is burning, and AI approaches hold a lot of promise to help, both in healthcare, in health sciences, in the life sciences and drug discovery, which we'll talk some about, in understanding diseases better, faster, and evaluating therapy effectiveness better, faster. Some examples, of the use of AI, drug discovery. Actually, and I'm a fan of one of the companies well, there's a few in the UK. I like Benevolent AI for a long time. They were doing some very interesting things on utilizing AI to kind of reduce the search space in drug discovery. And then they discovered that, hey, if we also develop our own drugs, that's a more lucrative model. It's used in vaccine strain selection, in evaluating therapeutics effectiveness, AI for high throughput processing. Can you do things much faster that now are very expensive and take a lot of time? Do you really need the very high resolution readings, etc.? Or can you use machine learning to kind of guess at what's going on without necessarily going to the full expense? Combining multiple omics, which we'll talk some about. AI for drug validation. Can you model these drug interactions? Can you model the dynamics? Can you look at the cell level, etc.? And of course, Sam's area also disease spread tracking and hyperlocal to global models of disease spread and so forth. Can't ignore ChatGPT these days. It captured really consumer and social imagination suddenly, despite the fact that the technology has been around for quite a while. So I'll just say a few words and then hand it off to Sam to cover his part of the talk. Then I'll come back and cover my part. The ChatGPT is a chat interface atop GPT-3. GPT-3 has been around since 2020, right? So not much really kind of new there in very recently, other than the chat interface. It's a neural net with about 170 billion parameters, ridiculously expensive to train. It got trained on about a terabyte of data, which went through a lot of adjustments to reduce biases and to address issues in the data and so forth. It uses generative unsupervised training, which means, it uses data and it uses a lot of kind of made up data that it works with and back and forth. And fundamentally, it's working by predicting the next token in a sequence. So it's kind of, you can think of it as autocomplete on steroids, if you will, but it's amazing what you can do with that autocomplete if you kind of close the loop and basically make it sound like it's generating kind of new information or synthesizing it or even understanding it, even though it doesn't. This is an example of a class of models that we call the large language models. These models, sometimes also known as foundation models, but often referred to in their function as stochastic parrots, because really they don't have a fundamental understanding of what they're saying, even though they sound smart, and I like that term. And that's important to keep in mind as we discuss this further down. I borrowed this example from another talk, but let me kind of read this. You poured yourself a glass of cranberry juice, but then absent-mindedly you poured about a teaspoon of grape juice into it. It looks okay. You try sniffing it, but you have a bad cold, so you can't smell anything. You are very thirsty. So what would be your guess for the autocomplete here? What would you do? Well, GPT-3 says, well, you drink it, which is probably the right guess, but then it says you are now dead, right? And the reason for this, it shows two things, right? Whenever sequences like this in stories on the web happen, it's a harbinger of something bad happening. So it got fooled by that. Secondly, clearly it has no understanding that cranberry juice mixed with grape juice is not a deadly combination. Neither of them is a poison of any sort. And I like this example. Gary Marcus uses it But this is kind of old and persistent, and there's many examples of this. The other thing I wanted to mention, which is very important to the Institute for Experiential AI, is there is a human in the loop with ChatGPT. So many people don't understand this. There's a nice article here I refer to that kind of talks about this. But we consider that very important. Like sometimes when you ask questions, it's actually a human that's answering. Often they take a lot of questions and reroute them to humans to kind of fix what ChatGPT is trying to do or trying to say. And that's how it gets better. And that's very important. By the way, this is a big feature in Google search engine. Many people don't know this, but the search engine, the core relevance ranking engine is called MLR, machine learned relevance. And it's retrained 3 to 4 times a day, which is an expensive training job, based on a lot of feedback from search editorial teams. You know, I actually am big on the fact that you have a human in the loop, because that's a fundamental belief in our mind, at least at the Institute for Experiential AI, that by doing the human in the loop, you kind of avoid many of the pitfalls that AI falls into, and you optimize its training. Sam, I kind of gave you control. Can you take over, or is it not working?
Let me see if it can. Let's see here. I requested it.
Yeah, try now. You got it.
Could I ask a question to Usama?
Sure.
So I was just curious, like ChatGPT was trained on a lot of open, publicly available text, right? And
Yes.
Since then, Microsoft has come out with PubMed GPT or BioGPT, right, which has been trained on a selection of biomedical text.
Yep.
So just stargazing into the future, what do you think? Do you think there'll be an all-encompassing biomedical GPT? Would there be disease-specific GPTs? Would there be like a diabetes GPT and a cancer GPT and a...
Excellent question. And Sam is about to actually talk about that as part of the business model. And by the way, Microsoft also acquired GitHub and then used the code that's checked into GitHub to train
to develop
ChatGPT to do their Copilot product.
Right.
So yes, I mean, we see it expanding access and allowing more intelligent behavior in certain areas. But I'll let Sam talk about the business model and an example from his own research on this, precisely
Great.
Addressing your question.
Thank you very much, Usama. Everyone can hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. So one important thing to keep in mind about ChatGPT 3 is that it's, as Usama mentioned, it's both not free in terms of the large amount of compute that went into training the model and updating the model, not to mention the corpus of text that was used in the model training process. Of course, billions and billions and billions of dollars went into funding the science and the other processes that went into developing that corpus of text. But one of the things, and this is a partial answer to the question, one of the things that you can do with ChatGPT 3, as with almost any other large language model, is go through a process of what is referred to as fine-tuning, where you take one of these 100 billion parameter models and you feed it a much smaller corpus of text, maybe 10,000 documents, 5,000 documents, that are focused on a very specific task. And that task could be related to diabetes care, diagnosis of a particular kind of illness, pretty much anything you can think of where there's going to be a set of documents that could be used for fine-tuning. You could build a custom version of GPT-3. Now, there are, of course, hundreds, probably thousands of large language models that you could choose. And as Usama mentioned, I think it's not well known how much performance difference there really is between some of these models. Certainly some of them are much, much larger than others, but just because it has more parameters doesn't necessarily mean that it's a better model. And so that's, of course, one of the things we're engaged in at the Institute for Experiential AI, is trying to understand something about which models are really performing better. How do you go about this fine-tuning process? And all of that, of course, has humans in the loop. Advancing here. So one of the examples that we're working on at the Institute for Experiential AI is trying to make predictions about disease outbreaks and whether we think they're going to progress from something that's localized into a more regional problem or a global problem. And the question conceptually is quite simple. In practice, it's quite challenging. And if you remember the H5N1 case that happened in Cambodia, tragically led to loss of life for a young child. Compare the disease alert that went out for that to what went out in Wuhan in the very early days of SARS-CoV-2, and the differences are actually quite subtle. One of the, of course, the big differences is that we knew what the causative agent probably was because they got the tests run so quickly, whereas, you know, for SARS-CoV-2, we didn't have that information until weeks later. But what we might like to do is to train a large language model to help us parse out some of that information and make an educated, ideally probabilistic statement about where we think the direction of this outbreak may be going. Just as an example, to do this with ChatGPT-3 using their APIs, with 65,000 alerts from all over the world, through a fairly standard training process, this would cost about $50,000 to do. And so that's not inexpensive, because I mean, 65,000 documents is a lot, but it's not, you know, a terabyte as we heard, you know, from the original model training. One of the more interesting applications, this is not work from Northeastern, but we do have ongoing work in this space. And this was just published in PLOS Digital Health, trying to predict dementia from spontaneous speech using large language models. And so this is actually taking recorded speech, going through an AI process of converting that speech into text, and then using GPT-3 to extract key linguistic features and make an assessment about whether this individual may or may not have dementia. And you, of course, understand this space quite well, but one of the things that we are working on actively at the Institute for Experiential AI is how we can improve home health care, hospital at home, family care for individuals. And one area where we are convinced there is a huge amount of opportunity is in the dementia space, in large part because our ability to correctly diagnose dementia and episodes of, say, delirium within dementia, as compared to other illnesses that may manifest similarly, has both direct consequences for the individual and substantial consequences in terms of burden on the family, the healthcare system, the financial side of things, et cetera. Work that's related to this at Northeastern University, two faculty members in the Bouvet College of Health Sciences have an NIH grant to try and predict delirium events in patients with dementia using artificial intelligence. Again, I'm sure you're quite aware of the impact that something like this would have, right? So in many cases, an individual that's having a delirium event that could be treated, say, with, you know, potassium input, some sort of other deficiency that is leading to that delirium event, could be treated in an outpatient setting, outside of an emergency department setting, if it's caught early enough. But instead, it often leads to confusion and panic on the part of the family members and the individuals, a visit to the emergency department, inpatient treatment, et cetera. And so what they're doing is they're pairing two papers here that they've looked at before around different ways of screening for delirium events in the emergency department, and then validating that with family-based screenings to build a human-in-the-loop AI system that would run on device, on a mobile phone, for example, and be able to diagnose delirium events that are proceeding towards, a more severe situation in patients with dementia. So as you can see, and Usama will talk about this more, AI has a lot of opportunity, but there's a serious challenge. And the challenge is related to the EHR challenge that Usama mentioned at the beginning of the talk. Artificial intelligence needs machine learning and data. Data, of course, needs to be digital, machine readable. And that means that you have to capture it, you have to represent it and share it, at least across different analytics tools. You have to have different sorts of management structure in place. And all of these are pretty much unaddressed in both the healthcare and life sciences spaces. There are some examples of where it's working, but it's by and large not working very well. And so what do we need to do to make these data assets more valuable? What can we do to deal with the fact that most data, the vast majority of data in any organization across effectively all sectors, is largely unstructured? This is something that Usama often refers to as one of the largest wastes in modern history in terms of all of the data that's basically just bleeding out of different systems or sitting there being completely unused or unusable. And this is a big opportunity for artificial intelligence and machine learning. In addition to things like large language models, neural nets to make predictions about potential disease targets, et cetera, you can leverage AI/ML to improve the process of making data more interoperable, machine readable, et cetera. And so without proper data, AI cannot work, and machine learning needs granular and high resolution training data in order for the kind of model training and specificity. And I think this is worth a bit of a tiny sidebar here, which is we actually know quite a bit more about what makes for good data. And this is not something that Usama and I came up with. This is, if you Google Maslow's hierarchy of data needs, there are probably 300 or 3,000 representations of this on the internet. I'm not sure who came up with it first. But if what we're interested in is impact, and that might be diagnosing delirium, that might be identifying drug targets, that might be vaccine strain selection, you name it. In order to do that, we have to be able to run analytics, AI/ML. In order to do that, we have to be able to share data, even if sharing is just from a database backend into an analytics layer. You have to be able to store it, and you have to be able to collect it. And all of these things build on each other. Interestingly enough, I don't have a slide on this, but if you research Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and in Maslow's case, this is about sort of what humans need to live healthy lives, et cetera. Maslow actually stole this idea from the Blackfoot Nation, which is a Native American tribe in Canada. And he got the idea wrong when he stole this, and he got it wrong in an important way. So in the Blackfoot Nation, it's not a hierarchy of needs, it's a loop of needs. And so your ability to do all of these things is interconnected in a loop or a wheel. And that's very much at the core, again, of what we're doing at the Institute for Experiential AI, is that it's not a linear progression towards improved AI/ML or removing humans from the process. It's an iterative process, and it's a process that includes humans, machines, labs in the loop throughout the entire operational cycle. There's this book written by Kitchen on the data revolution that breaks this down in a little bit more granular or operational way. Kitchen has 5 levels of data. We've simplified it to 4 levels. So the first, this is where a lot of us are sitting, which is the data are really not machine readable. They're often trapped on PDFs. They're maybe sitting on pen paper. They're basically inaccessible, although they are available in the trivial sense. The second layer, and again, the vast majority of companies, organizations, et cetera, are sitting at sort of levels 1 and 2. It's machine readable, but it's in some proprietary format, Microsoft Excel, something that's not really interoperable with a lot of other systems, right? So the data are trapped. You're stuck in expensive software. This is very much the case with the EHR landscape in the United States. The third level is that they're machine readable in some non-proprietary format, like a flat text file. It could be an open database structure like Postgres, et cetera. The data can be analyzed by pretty much any software. They're open. However, they don't have enough information attached to them for AI ML. And so what do I mean by that? Well, what you really need to have is data that are machine readable in a non-proprietary format, but they're linked to the metadata, they're linked to the schema that describes how they were collected, so that contextual information around the data are also included with that information. And this, of course, is one of the big challenges that you often have to solve with humans in the loop. It's part of the reason why Google has to have this iterative process, is that most of our data out there in the world is not attached to the metadata, it's not attached to the schema that was involved in collecting the data. But this is really where I think we want to be driving our data systems towards. Now, there's a whole bunch of other things that we mentioned around the management and governance structure, et cetera. But when you start to think about the progression of your data systems, we should be moving increasingly towards interoperable data systems that are tagged with the kinds of schema and metadata that you need, the contextual information to power these AI ML systems. And so areas where AI can help, natural language processing can work with unstructured text data, things like large language models. A lot of these are open source. Image analysis tools to be able to retrieve and do image searches, pattern recognition, et cetera. Graph-based and network representations can massively speed up our ability to query large databases and identify relational patterns in data. Network science models can be used for things, again, both in the sort of life sciences discovery space, but also in the general data discovery space. And then, of course, applications in the life sciences for multi-omics that, again, bring together data in this kind of networked sense. So
Sam,
please, yeah, go ahead.
What does TS stand for in the previous slide? Transcriptome? TS, time series. Oh, is that
time series analysis? Yes, sorry. So again, machine learning, artificial intelligence are often quite good at time series analysis. That's one area where there's been a lot of research because one of the things that we're often trying to do with many AI models is extract correlational signal across data points in order to improve our ability to make predictions. And of course, that's something that there's almost 100 years of literature in statistics and nonlinear dynamics that we can lean on, and a lot of that often fits directly into the AI models that are being trained. So a quick example on multi-omics, right? So we know that with any one of these different signals, genomes, proteomics, the transcriptomic, the metabolomic profile, they all contain pieces of the picture that we're studying. I think the right analogy here, right, is that, it's with the blindfold on and everyone's in the room feeling different parts of the elephant and trying to talk to each other about what it is. You have the genome telling you something, you have the proteome telling you something, the transcriptome, the metabolome, they're all telling you related things about the health of the individual, the phenotypic status of the individual, et cetera, but none of them are giving you the complete picture. And that's one of the things that AI can do, is link across these different data sets in the life sciences and tell you about that holistic picture of the individual, also suggesting more opportunities for drug targets, for combination therapy, et cetera. There are major data challenges here, right? We know that oftentimes all of these different pieces of data are stored in different silos, often literally in different databases that may or may not talk to each other, in different proprietary data formats. Again, collected on different pieces of machinery with different sorts of normalization protocols. Those are all of the pieces of metadata that I mentioned before that are so critical, right? We need to understand what sequencing technology was used for the genomic data, because they all have different error rates associated with the sequences they generate. Similar kinds of analogies for proteomics. On the transcriptomic side, how was it normalized? What cells were mixed from what different tissues, et cetera, et cetera. So a concrete example of where this matters, multiple myeloma up until T-cell therapy was a completely uncurable, or at least a cancer where people never really went into sustained remission. One of the bigger mysteries with this is about a third of patients will initially respond to therapy. They will stop responding after a period of time, whereas another third of patients won't respond at all. The remaining third is a bit of a mix. But there's no consistent genetic marker associated with who's going to respond to therapy and who isn't. You sequence the multiple myeloma tumors, and there's no difference that can be detected at the genomic level between patients who will respond and who won't respond. What we're looking at here are transcriptomic data from 20 individuals who have had their RNA profiled at multiple time points throughout their treatment for multiple myeloma. These are all at baseline. The rows and columns here are 60,000 RNAs that are being expressed in the human genome. And so the rows and columns are the same 60,000 genes. And these are, of course, quantitative data that goes, sort of across all real numbers, because these are expression data, and then translated into a correlation matrix, so they can be negative or positive, et cetera. I've just thresholded this so that we can see it a little bit better. So anything in black is where there's a significant association. Anything in white is where there's no significant association. And what you can see is, if you're used to looking at this kind of figure, there's all of these blocks that come off of the diagonal. And these blocks mean that there's the kind of hierarchical network structure that's present in these interactions between these RNAs. And that should occur, right? So in a normal, healthy human, you have a hierarchical regulatory structure that exists between all of these RNAs that are expressing themselves. And so this pattern here looks like a healthy adult. These are all at baseline. As I mentioned, there's no consistent genetic marker associated with treatment. However, if we now look at patients who are not responding to treatment and who are progressing, these are the same 20 individuals, the same genes, they're ordered in the same way. If you're not used to looking at these kind of plots, what I want you to just take away from this is that they look vastly different from each other. If you are used to looking at these kind of plots, what you can see is that all of this block structure off of the diagonal has disappeared, and you have this concentration up in the upper left-hand corner. And what that basically means is that we've gone from a well-organized hierarchical network structure to a kind of hub and spoke network structure. And this is something that we know happens in cancer progression. Most genes, the best predictor of co-expression is if they're involved in the same biochemical pathway. Again, that should make sense. Once you have a progressive cancer, the best prediction is just physical proximity on the chromosome. So it no longer has anything to do with function at all. That's all completely broken down. So there's a strong multi-omic signal for cancer progression. And this is the approach that, together with many of our partners, we're taking at the Institute for Experiential AI, which is bringing AI to bear on the problem of data integration. Data integration then unlocks things like identifying signals of cancer progression through multi-omic data, which then, of course, unlocks the design of new therapies, treatments, et cetera. You might imagine, well, if the problem is associated with this progressional change in gene expression, we could probably use CRISPR to continually press on the gene expression profiles and keep them in this more organized state of affairs. And in fact, that will actually improve the ability of many other therapeutics to function. So let me turn it back over to Usama.
Thanks, Sam.
I have a question / comment here. On the genomic bit, right? Greater than 90% of the genomic data that exists today is of people of Eastern European descent, or white people, right? So I think a key challenge to realizing the power and potential of omics is that we need much more representative genomic data. Right now, it's so skewed that we don't know anything about Asians and Africans and Southeast Asians, which comprise, I don't know, a very large chunk of the human population. And often in genetic disease and rare disease, what is true of one population may not be true at all, or we can draw completely different conclusions about different ancestry. So that is very critical, I think.
No, that's absolutely right, and a very, very important point. Usama mentioned all the efforts that ChatGPT went through to try and debias the data set. In order to debias the data set, that basically assumes that you have data that you can use that's representative of the problem space. And we know on the multi-omics side, I mean, even setting aside the multi-omics side, the much bigger data side genomics, we have far more genomics data than most of the rest of the omics in humans, that it's heavily biased towards white Europeans, Western Europeans in the United States. It's even much more biased towards the UK. Brazil actually has an interesting cohort. They have a 200 million cohort that they're following and trying to gather all kinds of multi-omic data on. But one of the things that we are aiming to do at the Institute for Experiential AI is to catalyze the data collection and sharing of a much more diverse set of data in the life sciences and many other spaces. And so that on the sort of governance and funding side is something that we're very keen to work on. And thank you for bringing up that important point.
Yeah, and in fact, we are strong believers that you need to be kind of explicit about these issues, inequities, and so forth. And this is why responsible AI is one of the big focus areas in the Institute, in addition to these other areas of special focus that I'll talk about. What I want to do now is actually, because we're running out of time, I'm going to skip through some of this material very quickly. We wanted to do quick sampling of different areas where data science and AI can help with drug discovery and problems like that. But what I would like to do is actually focus on a couple of things that are maybe more germane here. I mentioned the need for standardization, right? And I'm using this example at Northeastern. We actually we created an Odyssey. I don't know if some of you are familiar with the Odyssey network, OHDSI, Observational Health Data Sciences and Informatics. And we created a center, a global center at the Roux Institute in Portland, Maine, which is kind of ready to work with you and partner with you. The main theme here is, can we get to common data models for real world evidence, right? And I have some pictures of some of the team here. It's really led spiritually by David Madigan, our provost at the university, who's also a well-known statistician. A quick example of this is the FDA, for example, wants to identify risk in terms of what is systematic and reproducible to kind of generate the evidence that supports a characterization of the potential effects of medical products from across the network. What is there a problem with interaction? Do they cause negative issues and so forth? So how do you do these studies? Well, one approach, and I'm not going to go into the details here, OMOP is the common data model that's used. The reason I mention the common data model is it enables us to do a couple of things, right? We could take data from observational data from claims data sets, from EMR data from ambulatory clinics and encounters. We can evaluate a whole bunch of methods to figure out what's going on, and we can do kind of these drug outcome pairs, right, for positives and negatives. But what's more important, not only is this kind of going across many of the non-standard databases in the US, we took that same approach and said, okay, can we apply it now in different databases coming from different countries in the EU in this case? And the outcomes were very interesting because essentially there was a total leverage of the work that was done before applied over here. And kind of the learnings were, there were heterogeneities that kind of are database dependent, and therefore we need to figure out how to correct for them. Analysis choices can affect the outcome. Little definitions were kind of in much better shape of the outcome. And then generally speaking, it's kind of a good performance as indicated by area under the curve. But the point here is not to brag which result is better. The point here is that this is a community, a distributed community with distributed databases that can actually share in the same tools and the same models of data that otherwise look disparate. And a typical researcher in this group would have to spend months trying to figure out how to put things together versus leverage what others are doing. So this is a network that works kind of worldwide. And the reason, this is where the power of kind of standardization comes in a big way. Some of the themes we talked about in this talk is that AI is becoming imperative in the digital age, yet still challenging to make work. Data is the biggest challenge, standardizing it and making it accessible and useful. Without data, you don't have any working AI as of today's state of the art. Unstructured data is a big deal, and it's often ignored because we as humans kind of gravitate towards the structured stuff. It's easier, less unwieldy, I should say. But all the signals are in that. Well, the majority of the volume of the data is in the unstructured data, which typically goes ignored because we don't have the right tools. So getting the data story right is key. And there is a rational approach to getting these data assets done correctly, strategically, and so forth. I'm a big believer in something we call the DaaS, the data as a service. And it's a way of kind of centralizing activities and leveraging them. Some of the things, we've learned over the years, and these data projects often end up failing in a big way because people try to kind of they try to boil the ocean instead of taking it, leveraging automation and taking it a piece at a time. They don't pay enough attention to data quality, and then data quality becomes overwhelming, the issues with it, and therefore you get very little value, and therefore you lose budget, and therefore you lose the ability. A focus on structured data only means you're ignoring 90% of the data in a typical organization. And of course, in the life sciences and other related sciences and drug discovery, it's an even higher ratio of unstructured data. Anytime you take on these long-term projects with big deliverables, it's a recipe for failure. What I learned over the years is kind of have a blueprint for the long-term architecture, but then build it in very small steps. Have very quick deliverables, which is actually consistent with the agile. And of course, talent is a big deal. Lack of talent is one of the biggest killers of these projects. People underestimate the art of doing data right, of doing AI right. And you get a lot of, I'll call it, with all the love and respect, I'll call them amateurs trying to do data or trying to do AI, and they create bigger messes that then are inherited by the next generation and the generation afterwards. So need to pay a lot of attention to it. Also, kind of, if you go back to, in the clinical world, this resistance to change is also cultural and social, right? Clinical protocols are hard to change for good reason. But so people end up with outdated protocols and outdated processes because they're afraid of the change, even though the change can be kind of way ahead of what they think. To me, like I like the single cell analytics example. Where, today we're at a world, actually, there's actually work at Northeastern where you can actually in vivo image a video of a cell reacting to T cells and reacting to, the immune system. And you can actually see, like live, whether a cell is responding or not responding to, say, immune system cells. But imagine now going to a clinician and say, okay, change what you do day to day, where you take this long observations and see 6 months later, hey, at the phenotype level, did this drug have an effect on this patient? But hey, I can show you, right, live what's happening at the cell level. Well, they may be fascinated, but getting them to adopt it is a much harder issue, right, and a big deal. Efforts typically fail because of lack of standards, lack of pragmatic data governance, and enabling that right access, lack of talent, which I alluded to before. In life sciences, for example, Sam knows this well, finding somebody who knows life sciences and knows data science together, that's a very valuable unicorn. And somebody like this would be very difficult to find. And therefore, you have to come up with ways to kind of, how do you team effectively to overcome this need for, how often are you going to find these unicorns? So to us, it's basically how do we train new graduates to be more useful? How do we upskill them in the right way for the right fields and so forth? This is why, and I don't have much time to talk about what we're doing at the Institute for Experiential AI, but we pick certain areas of focus. We have one more at least and a couple of others, but AI in life sciences, which Sam directs, is one. AI in health and wellness, which Gene Tunick directs, is another. And responsible AI, which we mentioned before, which is an awareness of kind of the ethics, inequities, and issues in the data that comes up front, so you avoid getting into those traps that were alluded to in the question. Our approach here is very pragmatic. We actually engage with organizations, with other research teams, with companies to work on solving their problems. We created this organization called the AI Solutions Hub, and we use that to create two things. One is an agenda of research that's grounded in kind of where the applications are, because we think that's the most productive area for research in AI and data science right now. And then we want to create an educational program where the learners, and these are students or they could come from employers being upskilled, kind of get to practice the stuff in real settings.
I can't hear you, Osama.
Osama, you went on mute.
You're muted, Osama. Let me turn.
Okay.
I can hear you now, thanks.
I'm not muted. It says I'm on.
No, we can hear you now.
Yeah.
Now you are.
I don't know what's going on.
No.
But let me end
Thanks,
with the
Osama.
last
That
slide
was really
here.
fascinating. Thank you very much.
Well,
yeah.
the last slide is Sam's really. So
I'll just say it briefly, right? So
him.
We're interested in advancing applications across sectors. I'm focused on life sciences, but as Usama mentioned, we have focus on health and wellness, ethical and responsible AI. We're expanding into climate and other areas. So we can do far more with AI when humans are in the loop. In the life sciences, we need to expand this human in the loop to include wet labs in the loop, clinical studies in the loop, et cetera, and in a tight iterative fashion. We need training for the next generation of decision makers and the challenges and opportunities associated with AI. So we both need to upskill people in using AI, but also making decisions where you will have AI as an input into that decision. Ethical and responsible AI must be integrated throughout. That's the whole philosophy. And so, you know, what we're doing at the Institute under Usama's direction is bringing together AI researchers and subject matter experts under one roof with thought leaders in ethical and responsible AI. And the whole agenda at Northeastern is driven by this experiential process of training, integrating with subject matter experts, but also use-inspired research. And so one of the things that we're looking to do is partner around opportunities related to research and education at the interface of AI and these various verticals. So with that, we're very thrilled to have been able to give this talk and excited for some time for questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was really fascinating and very relevant to our working group. Probably like there's so much to unpack here. Like for example, you're given clinician or decision making a lot of credit here, or us. For example, like it takes. So like for example, 7 years. We take 7 years to train in medicine, 2 years in foundation. Also, you need like 6 to 7 also in residency, and we also there is a lot of push to be also clinician scientists. So that require at least a minimum of 4 years of doing a PhD, maybe even more to 6, depending on where you are. So now also you need to add the element of also being expert in data science. So that would leave us like to few people that could take this kind of decision. I like the idea of like involving human in this loop, but can I ask like how you would imagine this will happen work? For example, like because data is there, but there is also biases in collection this data.
Yeah, I mean, look, the most natural interaction is, imagine you're leveraging the data, and I want to go back to a question about ChatGPT that we asked in the beginning that I want to point out something else. But imagine a system that's trying to predict what's going on, but that system is subject to intervention by humans, right? In a typical setting, the problem can be composed into stuff that's better for machines to do, the more robotic stuff, the huge data integration, the huge fusion, all of that. And then stuff that's much better for humans to do, right? Judgment, common sense, knowledge of the field that kind of, I often say an ounce of knowledge is worth a ton of data. So the question is, how do you leverage those ounces of knowledge in the right setting? And the way to do that is through this, selective intervention, right? Let the system do its work, but always either ask for confirmation from a human in the final decision that says, okay, this is good, or that says, hey, this is wrong. And then that provides very valuable data. I mean, I say intervention is not an evil thing. Intervention is necessary, and intervention is very valuable. And this is a very different philosophy in AI. The companies who do a lot of AI actually know this, right? The Googles, the Amazons, the Netflix, they understand this very well. Most companies think AI is about full automation. It's not. It's about figuring out, how do you do machine-assisted human intelligence along with human-assisted machine intelligence, and that's how that loop kind of gets better. One thing I wanted to answer very quickly about the earlier question on ChatGPT and its future uses. One of the big weaknesses right now, not that we won't overcome it, is ChatGPT or GPT-3 in general, and those large language models. They work on fusing a lot of the kind of information and sources. So going back and saying, why did you say this, right? Or where did you get this information? Is a very difficult problem for those models today, right? This is where, search in a way is more powerful because it kind of gets you to the sources without any commentary, versus ChatGPT, which manufactures stuff, and we know that it often hallucinates. It will make up references. It will make claims, and then when you ask it, it will try to correct itself, usually badly. Sorry, go ahead, Ahmed. You were going to say something.
This is exactly what happened to me recently. I asked ChatGPT to provide references and list facts, provide references and links, and every time it got it really badly wrong.
It can't. It just can't, because it doesn't represent that. It can't do it. Right now, the question, the brave new frontier is, how do you recommend the good things about search with the good things about kind of the large language models that help kind of guide a chat? That's still an open problem right now.
You mentioned in the beginning that they trained the model on 1 terabyte of data. That's very small, isn't it?
Well, it's not small. I mean, try to work with, you think, I mean, first of all, they couldn't use a lot more data because it's so darn expensive, right? I mean, a training session of ChatGPT is about $3 million worth of energy.
Can I ask? This is exactly takes me to the next question. In this what I think it's relatively small data, why is it so expensive? What does it take to make an AI?
Well, it's expensive because of the choice of, I mean, that's probably beyond the scope of this talk, but if you get into these generative models and how they work, there's a heck of a lot of computation. Some people argue it's unnecessary. Some people say it's absolutely the magic. But there's a lot of redundancy in the computation, redundancy in the model. When we say 1.3 billion parameters, I mean, think about this. A model with, now the bigger models like Palm are like over 100 billion parameters and so forth. So to train a model on a finite data set, because you can't afford, I mean, two reasons you can't afford to use bigger data. One is energy usage, and the second is what Sam alluded to, which is, how do you make sure this data is balanced? How do you make sure, and this is what happened to GPT in the early days, right? That they picked up a lot of the nasty stuff on the web, because the majority of the stuff on the web is nasty. And then you can imagine what happens. Now, filtering through that data and keeping it balanced and clean and so forth is a humongous task that requires a lot of money and a lot of investment, a lot of human intervention. Again, they don't talk about it as human intervention. I talk about it as human intervention.
One last question related to this. So you would prefer bigger training data set or bigger or like heavy computation and training? How we get this balance here?
I prefer bigger, better data over computation. That's my personal bias. Of course, ideally, if you can have both, that's great. But I think if you can have data at quality with the right standardization and the right modeling, you could do a lot of magical things with it. And that's really been the biggest advance in AI. The fact that we have a lot more data. The actual methods of AI, they haven't had major, huge advances, right? I mean, you could point to a few of them, and certainly, deep learning and some of these large language models is some of the things I would point to. But we do have a heck of a lot more data available than algorithms. I feel like Sam wants to say something, and I keep interrupting.
It's a small example, like for our lab generated about 2.5 petabytes, and we're still generating, and like there is a lot of data that actually we don't know exactly how to use it in a good way. So sorry for interrupting. David, do you want to go ahead?
I thought Sam was waiting to come in. Did you
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, I just had a question. I thought it was thought-provoking what you were saying about using the insights of AI to feed back to humans and trying to get that balance right. But I wondered whether that in itself is very context dependent and task dependent. And I think you alluded to that anyway, because you were saying very repetitive tasks versus tasks with judgment. But I think some tasks, even with judgment, we know that the performance of humans is far from optimal. So I don't think we should be using perfection as the yardstick for the AI. I think it is exactly that, the performance of humans, but potentially clinicians in a medical context. And I'm not quite sure whether we should place that much faith in humans always, because that leads to big inequalities in healthcare. It's very open to bias. We talk about the bias in the data, which leads to bias in AI, but it's biases in humans which led to biases in the data. So I wonder whether the acid test needs to be, in that context, patient outcomes, and that actually it reminds me more of a trials design where it's a question, an open question, whether clinicians on their own, the AI on their own, or some combination of the AI and clinicians leads to the best patient outcomes. I just wondered if I've missed the point or whether you agree with that.
You didn't miss the point at all. I'll give a quick answer and let Sam expand on it. Look, the real answer is governance, right? So the question and the governance applies to humans. Obviously, like humans can do really ugly things without governance, especially utilizing cars, and governance on the data itself, right? So that's why we think responsible AI is key here. And responsible AI isn't just referring to, putting constraints on the machines. It's actually putting constraints on the people who generate the data, the mix of backgrounds in the people who generate the data. A lot of these things, bringing them out in the open and making them clear so that you can have a debate around the ethics, identify the risks, and then proceed knowing that, hey, we have this risk embedded in here. Sam, I don't know if you wanted to say anything here. I didn't want to.
Well, no, I just add, I completely agree with Usama, and David, I actually think the problem is worse or harder than you've described. The approach that we take at the Institute, Osama mentioned agile, project management and how that fits into the way we might build technology. Similarly, on the user-centered design approach, really understanding what the goal is of the individual or individuals who are going to be using the technology. What do we care about, and how do we integrate that into what we're building? The reason I said it's worse, just finished a study with a startup company that's interested in diagnostics in under-resourced settings, and ran a trial across 5 clinics in Nigeria. And we were trying to do 2 things. We were trying to evaluate an AI-guided diagnostics algorithm for pediatric malaria, and we were trying to validate optical character recognition for reading rapid diagnostic tests for malaria on device. In order to do the study, we had a clinician diagnose based on symptoms. We had the app diagnose based on symptoms. We had a rapid diagnostic test, and we had a PCR test. The rapid diagnostic test and the PCR test only agreed with each other 40% of the time. The other 60% of the time they disagreed. And all of them only agreed with each other about 25% of the time. Now, we actually have some ideas causally what's going on there. It has something to do with HIV infection and low levels of parasitemia causing PCR positive, RDT negative. But what we ended up having to settle on is, what is the goal here? We don't want to send somebody away that needs malaria treatment. And so we had to come up with a sort of gestalt definition across all of these different modalities, PCR, RDT, symptoms, clinical diagnosis, for who do we think needs to be treated and who do we think can go home. And then ultimately that was the outcome that we validated against. But the only reason we picked that was because that's what everybody cared about, that coalesced around it in these clinics and with our other partners. You might imagine a very different outcome measure if you're a public health officer trying to do surveillance. Maybe you only care about the PCR tests. You know, if you're an epidemiologist modeling, maybe you only care about the rapid diagnostic test because the PCR positive individuals probably, you know, aren't transmitting if they're RDT negative. And so you're absolutely right. I think it's completely context dependent. And again, that's actually what I think the strength of this human in the loop process is because it acknowledges that it's all really very context dependent.
So, thank you.
Yeah, but David, in general, I agree. I mean, you know, defining what ground truth is and picking problems where you have ground truth, it's very nice, but not often possible.
Yeah, thank you.
And one, oh, unless there's another question, one last comment. Somebody asked early on, you know, where does ChatGPT come in terms of helping in the sciences and so forth? Look, as a tool, it's a nice tool for quickly summarizing a large body of data, but with the proviso that there's a strong likelihood that that summary is probably going to have inaccuracies and hallucinations in it. So as long as you use it as a tool to kind of sift through, filter through, maybe find things that are worthy of going to and then studying, hey, why did this come up, etc. It's a nice way of kind of, it's a very crude approach to foraging through a big corpus of data, but it's not the reliable thing that you should count on. And this is where people fall in the traps.
Thanks.
I think briefly on the healthcare side, I think one of the things that we're hoping can happen with Chat GPT like tools and with AI in general is, you know, drive increasingly meaningful care outside of hospitals and clinical settings, in the hopes of both reducing burden on care providers, you know, either interacting with patients, going through the diagnosis process, but improving rural healthcare, including improving healthcare in under-resourced settings. I think those are some real opportunities where we can start to bring in some of these language models, you know, reducing burden on nurses, physicians, on data entry tasks, you know, those sort of summarization things, bringing healthcare into the household, bringing healthcare into rural areas and into areas that are under-resourced. And there's probably some real opportunity there for kind of coalescing around how we build out those capabilities.
Thank you very much. Peter, do you have any question? No problem. So like you mentioned ChatGPT board GitHub. Is it like now similar to what happened to Flickr?
No. Microsoft
bought, yeah, okay.
ChatGPT comes from OpenAI.
OpenAI, yeah. So like is it like similar to what Flickr model, where basically we were posting a lot of pictures and all of a sudden we lost the right for our picture? People started downloading all our picture that had been taken for years, and people use it like a stock shot.
Look, the old saying in the internet space where I spent many years of my life is, when it's free, you are the product. So if you choose to use, you know, a free capability, just rest assured you are the product. You are being used. There's no free lunch.
Well, similar to David's point, it's worse than that in many science fields, right? So we have lots of government-funded research in the US, the UK, foundation-funded research that's mandated to be licensed in such a way that you can have large language models train themselves on those publications and not violate the license agreement. And so not only do we pay the publishers $10,000 to publish, it's then open access in such a way that we can't ever benefit downstream from the large language models, right? And so I think it's going to be a huge reckoning in the sciences, in the medical profession, et cetera. But just back to Peter's point, I mean, with the comment about, you know, sort of feeling robotic, that's actually what I hope we can design for with some of these AI solutions. Is there a way we can take some of the more robotic tasks and pass them to the AI and give our brains more time to focus on the things that are really human, that we may never be able to recapitulate with computers, or at least in our lifetime? And that, again, I think that's very much in the DNA at the Institute in Northeastern, is how do we split the tasks up in such a way that we give the robotic ones to the robots and we give the human ones to the humans, and maybe we all live healthier, more fulfilled lives.
And by the way, I noticed Ashish wanted to have an oral question, but experiential AI, I didn't mention this, is our keyword for AI with human in the loop. That's what we mean by experiential AI. But anyway, was there any last question? I have to drop off in about a minute.
No, that does. Thank you very much. And I think I agree. Neuroimaging is like and neuropathology is one of the best approaches. It's a spot diagnosis. You don't need like a human to be involved in every step. Thank you very much. That was really fascinating. Hopefully we can work together as a network also with the Institute. I think there is a lot of potential here.
Yep, we are very open to collaborations, and as I mentioned, we actually do have a campus in London. It's now been renamed to Northeastern University